Mr. Speaker, a point of personal privilege, please.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, for some weeks now we have been discussing here on the House floor two great issues that confront us. One, of course, is the Virginia biennial budget, and the other is the question of Medicaid expansion. And I would like to speak to that today, but I'd like to speak to it perhaps from a different perspective than what others have presented here on the House floor. And I'd like to make four major points if I could. And they are as follows. First of all, doors. I spent a considerable amount of time at the doors since I entered public life. In 2009, I knocked on 27,000 doors over a 9-month period, continuously, 6 to 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I believe I understand what the people think in the district I represent. In 2011, I knocked on probably 10,000. And in 2013, 20,000. And so I think I know where people are coming from. Each Saturday that I've been home in this session, Mr. Speaker, I've knocked on the doors of neighbors in my district. And last weekend, my wife and I knocked on our 500th door. And this issue of Medicaid is very much on the minds of my constituents. And so there are these two defining issues of the budget and Medicaid expansion. We've heard from both sides of the aisle. And what we have heard is a lot of numbers and facts and figures and statistics. And I got to tell you, regardless of who they're coming from, I don't particularly set a lot of stock by them. What I set stock by is one number, Mr. Speaker, and that number is 17 trillion and climbing. 17 trillion and climbing. We have essentially run out of the capacity to do these sorts of things, fellow members of this assembly. But I believe what I'm hearing from my neighbors, and I'm hearing it from large numbers in Prince William County in the 51st House District, and that is do not expand Medicaid in accordance with the conventional model that has been proposed. 2 weeks ago, I did a telephone town hall. 1,800 folks on the call at one point or another, and as early as possible, I did a poll. It's unscientific, but I think it's an indicator. 81% of the participants in my telephone town hall said do not expand. And so that's what I have learned from the doors, from face-to-face contact with my neighbors. The second point that I would make has to do with another D word, and it's disavow. Disavow in prior years, in keeping with the faith of caring for those who have worn the cloth of the country. In prior years, there was a promise made to individuals, to Americans that were enticed to step forward and wear the cloth of the country. And that promise was that in exchange for presenting yourself in a profession that could bring great personal harm or loss of life, and also accompanied by less compensation than your civilian counterparts would receive, that in turn you would have lifetime medical care in a military treatment facility, and failing that, in a referral facility off base. Colonel Lingenfelter can tell you about that. So can Commander Stolley, Lieutenant Morris, Captain Miller, Sergeant Hugo, and a whole host of others in this chamber who have worn the uniform, a total of 19 individuals, and 16 in the Senate for a total of 35. And so what happened is those medical benefits were eventually eroded away, where every person who has served a career in uniform or has been medically retired now pays a premium for their health insurance and a separate premium for their dental care. So that was withdrawn. So I presented to all of you in the context of this argument that the 100% and then the decrement to 90% is probably and likely unsustainable. Last month, there were deep cuts announced by the Department of Defense to earned, and I mean earned, military retirements. And then just yesterday, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel announced the deepest cuts in probably 4 decades that will or significantly reduce, I should properly say, the TRICARE benefit for retired military families and military families on active duty. On March the 4th, we're going to bring out onto this House floor a large contingent of young men and women wearing battle dress uniform, the 1710th Transportation Company, freshly returned from Afghanistan. These young men and women of the Virginia National Guard are ones, part of this organization, that has seen this erosion. And so I say we will see that replicated and play out in the future in this unsustainable system. And so the best indicator of future potential is past performance. The third point I would make is disappointment. Disappointment that we have failed to honor the gentleman's and gentlewoman's agreement we had between both chambers and both houses last year when we established the Medicaid Innovation and Reform Commission. We removed that process from the budget to insulate the core functions of government, as the gentleman from Colonial Heights said. The other body has decided to reinsert it, and that places at risk some very essential services for the citizens who sent us here to represent them. If we rush the decision on expansion, I believe that it will have the same net effect as the rushed decision to implement the Affordable Care Act. If you want it bad, you'll get it bad. We've been down this road before. Some cite Medicaid expansion as what? A stimulus to the economy. Well, our federal counterparts pumped money, big money, into our economy with negligible effect. We've been down this road before about creating jobs, but as we all know, the Congressional Budget Office has forecasted the potential for the loss of the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs in the country. In other words, for me, this redistributionist arithmetic doesn't add up because it is premised on other people's money, and it's also premised on borrowed money from foreign shores. I believe it's one reason, I wasn't part of the deliberations, but I believe it's one reason that the Supreme Court wisely withdraw the requirement for the states for a mandatory Medicaid expansion, and why only roughly half of the states have done so. And so, after doing hundreds of doors over the last several weeks, these are the conclusions that I've reached. And then lastly would be another D word, dialogue. And I'm talking about a good faith effort between the conferees to move forward, as we have always been able to do before in this Commonwealth. I believe we need to stay the course. We need to embrace this process of the Merck reforms. We need to remove this business from the budget and not hold at risk these essential services and avoid replicating the federal gridlock that we would see north. We need to step away from this ideological insistence on expanding against the wishes of a good number of our citizens. And I believe that it is wise to audit Medicaid as we have decided to do in this chamber. And the reason for that, if you'll remember the ill-advised shutdown 4 years ago of rest stops and the resulting audit of VDOT that took place uncovered $1.5 billion that we applied to the transportation needs of the Commonwealth. To do otherwise is to risk a danger that if that federal subsidy is withdrawn that will power any sort of Medicaid expansion, what we will end up with is the necessity to trigger gargantuan tax increases, Mr. Speaker, or to go to those essential core services in order to fund that. And so I believe we need to move forward with a civil dialogue. And I would like to say one thing, and it is simply this. I am willing to talk to anyone on any side of this issue, and they're welcome to come to my office. Most have been civil and constructive, regardless of their perspective. But for those who come into my office and speak rudely and abuse my staff, as has happened in recent days, just a very few. I don't want to overplay that, Mr. Speaker. But those who do will encounter me in a very different way than they've ever encountered me. And so with that, let me close by recognizing what I read in an op-ed today. Lieutenant Governor Northam in the Daily Press said, if you refer to yourself as a patriot, I strongly encourage you to discuss favorably with your delegates and senators the benefits of expanding health care. I would offer an alternative perspective, Mr. Speaker, and that is that if you profess to be a patriot, and I know Ralph Northam to be a good and honorable man, I've worked with him on legislation, but if you profess to be a patriot, it is crucial that we be good stewards of the public trust and sound keepers of the public purse. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.